Draco barely had time to process what he just committed to, before Hermione was already pulling out a worn piece of parchment from her bag. The map of Malfoy Manor. She spread it out on the table, her fingers tracing the different wings of the estate. Lucius won't be alone. He always has at least 2 Death Eaters stationed near him at all times. Harry leaned forward. And what about Narcissa? Draco exhaled. She won't interfere. Hermione glanced at him, concern flickering in her eyes. Are you sure? Draco nodded. She's never truly been one of them. My mother is complicated, but she won't stand in our way. Ron let out a low whistle. Blimey, we're actually doing this. Not yet, Hermione said. We need a plan. Draco pulled out his wand and tapped the parchment. There's a hidden entrance here, he murmured, pointing to a concealed corridor that led directly to Lucius's study. He'll be there tonight. That's when we strike. Harry's jaw clenched. And what about Voldemort? Draco hesitated. He won't be there, Ron scoffed. And you know that how? Draco met his gaze evenly. Because he's expecting me to be there. A beat of silence passed between them. Hermione exhaled. Then we don't have time to waste. That night, they moved swiftly through the shadows. Under the cover of disillusionment charms, they made their way through the secret passage Draco had memorized as a child. His heart pounded as they reached the end of the corridor. Lucius's study was just beyond the doors. Draco turned to the others. Stay behind me. Hermione reached for his hand and squeezed it once before stepping back. Draco inhaled deeply, then pushed the doors open. Lucius was seated behind his desk, a glass of fire whiskey in his hand. His gray eyes flickered up, taking in his son standing before him. So, Lucius said calmly, setting the glass down, you finally made your choice. Draco didn't hesitate. He raised his wand. I chose a long time ago. Lucius sighed, rising to his feet. You're a fool, Draco. Do you truly believe you can win? Draco's grip tightened. I know I can. Lucius smirked. Then prove it. In an instant, his wand was drawn. Spells exploded through the room. Draco barely dodged a streak of green light before returning fire. The others surged in behind him, Harry and Ron shielding Hermione as she cast protective wards around them. Lucius was fast, strong, but Draco had something his father didn't. He had them. A burst of red light struck Lucius in the chest, sending him crashing into the bookshelves. Draco stood over him, wand still raised. His father looked up, blood trickling from the corner of his mouth. Lucius exhaled slowly. You really have grown, haven't you? Draco's hand trembled. This was it. The moment he had dreamed of for years. The moment he proved he wasn't his father's puppet. Lucius smirked. Do it then. Draco's wand didn't waver, but he didn't cast the curse either. Hermione's voice was soft behind him. Draco, he closed his eyes, then he lowered his wand. Lucius let out a low chuckle. You don't have it in you. Draco turned away. No, but I don't need to. He flicked his wand, and thick, enchanted chains wrapped around Lucius, binding him in place. Ron whistled. Well, that works too. Harry nodded. Let's go. We don't have much time. Draco took one last look at his father before stepping away. Lucius Malfoy had lost, and Draco had finally won. The moment they exited Lucius's study, Draco felt the weight of the moment settle in his chest. His father, the man who had dictated his entire life, was bound and helpless. But this wasn't over. Not yet. We need to move now, Harry whispered, leading the way through the dimly lit corridor. The wards around the manor will be triggered soon. Ron adjusted his grip on his wand. And what exactly is our exit strategy? Draco kept his pace steady, but his mind was racing. There's a hidden passage beneath the east wing. It leads to the outer grounds, where we can disapparate. Hermione nodded, glancing back at him. And your mother? Draco's stomach twisted. She'll be safe. He hoped that was true. They reached the east wing quickly, slipping through the shadows. The halls of Malfoy Manor were unnervingly silent, but Draco knew better than to trust the quiet. As they rounded a corner, a familiar voice sent a chill down his spine. Leaving so soon, Draco? Bellatrix. Draco barely had time to react before a jet of purple light shot toward them. He shoved Hermione out of the way, raising a shield just in time to deflect the curse. Bellatrix Lestrange stepped forward, her dark eyes gleaming with madness. "I knew you weren't to be trusted." Ron raised his wand. "Yeah, you're a little slow on the uptake, aren't you?" Bellatrix sneered. "And yet, you're the ones trapped." A dozen robed figures emerged from the shadows behind her. Death Eaters. Draco's blood ran cold. "Damn it," Harry muttered. Bellatrix giggled, twirling her wand between her fingers. "Our lord had his suspicions about you, dear nephew." She sighed dramatically. "What a shame. You could have been great." Draco clenched his jaw. "I'd rather die than serve him." Bellatrix's grin widened. "Oh, I do hope you mean that." Then, chaos. Spells exploded through the corridor. Harry and Ron lunged forward, deflecting incoming curses. Hermione moved with calculated precision, her wand dancing as she sent defensive wards across their path. Draco focused on Bellatrix. He had spent years watching her duel, memorizing her unpredictable movements, but now she was watching him. "Come now, dear Draco," she taunted, sidestepping his hex. "You'll have to do better than that." He gritted his teeth, sending a sharp blast of magic toward her. She deflected it effortlessly, her laughter filling the air. Then, Hermione cried out. Draco's head snapped toward her, just in time to see a Death Eater's curse strike the side of her shoulder. She stumbled, pain flashing across her face. A violent fury erupted inside him. Draco turned back to Bellatrix and didn't hesitate. His next spell was fast. Too fast. A streak of white-hot light shot from his wand, slamming into Bellatrix's defenses and shattering them. She was thrown backward, her body crashing into the stone wall. For the first time, she looked startled. Draco advanced. "Still enjoying yourself, Auntie?" Bellatrix grinned, wiping blood from her lip. "Oh, now you're interesting." She flicked her wand, but before she could cast another curse, a blinding explosion rocked the entire manor. The walls trembled. A chandelier crashed to the ground. Dust and debris filled the air. Ron shielded his face. "What the hell was that?" Harry's eyes widened. "The Order." Draco's pulse pounded. "Reinforcements." Bellatrix snarled, stepping back. The Death Eaters around her hesitated, their confidence shaken. Harry took the opportunity. "Now's our chance. Run." They didn't need to be told twice. Draco grabbed Hermione's hand, pulling her toward the passageway as spells flew around them. The sounds of battle filled the halls, but he didn't stop running. Not until they burst through the hidden exit, fresh air hitting their faces. They were outside. "Go now," Draco shouted. Harry, Ron, and Hermione spun on the spot, vanishing into thin air. Draco took one last look at Malfoy Manor, the only home he had ever known. Then he turned and disapparated. Draco landed hard on the stone floor of the safe house, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The moment his feet touched the ground, he instinctively spun around, wand raised, scanning for any sign of pursuit. They had made it. Harry, Ron, and Hermione stood beside him, all equally disheveled. Hermione clutched her injured shoulder, wincing as she tried to move. Ron was panting, his hands still clenched around his wand, while Harry immediately strode toward the nearest window to check for any unwanted visitors. Draco exhaled sharply, finally allowing himself to process what had just happened. They had faced Bellatrix. They had fought Death Eaters inside Malfoy Manor. And most importantly, Lucius Malfoy was no longer a threat. Ron let out a low, breathless laugh. "Well, that was mental." "No kidding," Harry muttered, rubbing his temple. "The Order must have timed their attack perfectly." Hermione hissed as she tried to shift her arm. Draco turned to her, his expression darkening. "Let me see," he said, stepping closer. "I'm fine," she insisted. Draco arched a brow. "Granger." She huffed but didn't protest when he gently pulled back her sleeve. The wound was raw, a deep gash from the Death Eater's curse, and already bruising around the edges. Draco clenched his jaw. He should have protected her. He should have seen the curse coming. Hermione must have noticed the look in his eyes because she reached up with her good hand, fingers brushing against his. "Draco, I'm all right." He swallowed and nodded, though he didn't quite believe it. "Let me heal it." She hesitated, then nodded. Draco raised his wand, muttering a soft incantation under his breath. A faint, cool light enveloped her wound, and Hermione let out a relieved sigh as the pain eased. "Not bad, Malfoy," Ron admitted, watching from the side. Draco rolled his eyes. "Thanks, Weasley." Harry turned back from the window. We should check in with the Order. They'll want to know what happened, Ron groaned. And by the Order, you mean Lupin and McGonagall, right? Because if we have to see Molly, she's going to kill us, Hermione muttered. Harry smirked. Yeah, probably. Despite everything, Draco found himself shaking his head in amusement. He had spent most of his life believing he had no choice but to follow the path his father had carved for him, that his fate was bound to the Malfoy name and all that came with it. But standing here, surrounded by them, his enemies turned allies, the people who had fought beside him, he realized something. He wasn't just running anymore. He was fighting for something, and he wasn't going to stop. The safe house was silent, save for the occasional crackle of the fireplace. After everything that had happened at Malfoy Manor, the quiet felt unnatural, like the calm before another storm. Draco sat near Hermione, his gaze flicking to her now-healed shoulder. The wound was closed, but he could tell she was still feeling the effects of the fight. She was quieter than usual, her fingers absently tracing the edge of her sleeve. Ron paced near the door, his restlessness evident. All right, so what now? We wait here until someone from the Order shows up? Harry nodded. They should already know something happened. If the attack on Malfoy Manor went as planned, they'll be expecting us. Draco leaned back, rubbing his temples. You realize they're not exactly going to welcome me with open arms, right? Ron snorted. Yeah, well, after what we just pulled, I don't think any of us are getting a warm welcome. Hermione finally spoke, her voice soft but firm. It doesn't matter. You're one of us now. Draco stilled, his eyes meeting hers. The certainty in her tone made something tighten in his chest. He had spent years believing he was alone, that even when he abandoned his father's beliefs, he was still an outsider, caught between two worlds. But Hermione didn't hesitate. She didn't doubt. And for the first time, Draco allowed himself to believe it might be true. Before he could respond, a sudden crack echoed through the room. Everyone jumped, wands raised, as a figure materialized in the doorway. Remus Lupin. His robes were dusty, his face lined with exhaustion, but his sharp eyes swept across them in an instant. You're all safe, he said, exhaling. Thank Merlin. Harry lowered his wand. Lupin, what happened? Did the Order take the manor? Lupin's expression darkened. We managed to drive most of the Death Eaters out, but Bellatrix and a few others escaped. The manor is in ruins, but Voldemort wasn't there. He turned his gaze to Draco. And your father? Draco held his stare. Lucius won't be a problem anymore. Lupin didn't ask for details, he simply nodded. Then that's one less obstacle in our way. Ron let out a breath. So what now? We can't just sit around and wait for them to come after us. No, Lupin agreed, which is why we need to regroup. The Order is meeting at the Burrow. Ron groaned. Brilliant. Exactly where I wanted to be. Draco crossed his arms. And what about me? Lupin studied him for a long moment. You saved their lives tonight. That's not something we take lightly. His voice was calm but firm. You're coming with us, Malfoy, whether the others like it or not. Draco hesitated, but then Hermione's hand brushed against his, just briefly. A silent reassurance. He met her gaze, and he made his choice. All right, he said. Let's go. The tension inside the Burrow was suffocating. Draco had barely stepped through the door before half a dozen wands were pointed at him. Moody's magical eye whirled in its socket, locked onto Draco with an intense scrutiny that made his skin crawl. Bill Weasley stood tense beside him, and even Arthur Weasley, one of the kindest men Draco had ever encountered, regarded him with guarded eyes. Explain, Moody barked, his gruff voice cutting through the air. Harry stepped forward, placing himself between Draco and the rest of the Order. He's with us, he said firmly. Draco fought against the Death Eaters at Malfoy Manor. He's not on their side anymore. Moody let out a low, unimpressed grunt. Forgive me if I'm not convinced. Ron rolled his eyes. Look, we don't have time for this. We need to focus on what's coming next, not waste time arguing about Malfoy. Molly Weasley appeared from the kitchen, her expression flickering between relief and exasperation. Ronald, she scolded before pulling him into a crushing hug. You could have died. Do you ever think before running into danger? Ron groaned. Mum, don't mum me, she snapped before moving on to Hermione, fussing over her injured shoulder despite Hermione's insistence that she was fine. Draco stood awkwardly near the doorway, feeling more like an intruder than ever. He had known this wouldn't be easy. He had spent years on the other side, mocking these people, standing against them. It was foolish to think they would accept him overnight. Lupin stepped in. Enough, we have bigger problems. His gaze swept across the room. Lucius Malfoy is out of the picture, but Voldemort's forces are still strong. And now that Draco has openly turned against them, he's a target. Moody scowled but lowered his wand. We'll be keeping an eye on you, boy. Draco met his gaze without flinching. Wouldn't expect anything less. Before Moody could reply, a voice interrupted them. What is he doing here? Draco turned to see Ginny Weasley standing in the doorway, her brown eyes blazing with fury. Her gaze flicked to Hermione, standing close to him, and something unreadable passed over her face before she snapped. Have you lost your mind? You trust him? Hermione straightened. Yes. Ginny let out a sharp breath, shaking her head. After everything he's done? After. She turned to Harry. You can't be serious. Harry's jaw was set. Ginny, we don't have time for this. Make time, she shot back. This is Draco Malfoy. Silence filled the room. Draco clenched his fists but didn't say a word. He had expected this. Ginny had more reason than most to hate him. He had been part of the same world that put her through hell in her first year. But before anyone could reply, Hermione spoke. I know who he is, she said, her voice steady. I also know that people can change, that sometimes the choices we make now matter more than the mistakes we made before. Ginny's expression didn't soften, but she didn't argue either. Lupin sighed. We have enough enemies without fighting each other. Draco's choice to turn against the Death Eaters wasn't easy. That counts for something. Ginny exhaled sharply but finally relented, stepping back. Fine, but if he betrays us... He won't, Hermione said quietly. Draco looked at her, surprised by how much faith she had in him, and for the first time, he realized he wanted to be the person she believed him to be, no matter what it took. The Burrow remained tense long after the initial confrontation. Even as the rest of the Order settled into quiet discussions about their next steps, Draco could feel the weight of their stares. He knew trust wouldn't come easily. He didn't expect it to. But what unsettled him more than anything was Ginny's reaction. He had expected hostility, maybe even threats, but the look she had given Hermione before storming off still lingered in his mind. He wasn't blind. He had spent years perfecting the art of reading people, and what he saw in Ginny's expression wasn't just anger. It was something else. Jealousy. Draco pushed the thought aside as Hermione nudged him, drawing his attention back to the present. Come on, she murmured. Let's step outside for some air. He followed her out onto the back porch, grateful for the crisp night air against his skin. The stars above were bright, undisturbed by the war raging below. Hermione leaned against the railing, arms crossed as she exhaled. That went about as well as I expected. Draco scoffed. If that's what you call well, I'd hate to see your version of disaster. She gave him a small smile, but it faded quickly. They'll come around. Eventually. Draco glanced back at the house. Not all of them. Hermione turned toward him, tilting her head. You're not giving them enough credit. He let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. Granger, you do remember who I am, right? Yes, she said simply. And I also know you're not the same person you were when this war started. Something in the way she said it made Draco's chest tighten. For years he had been defined by his name, his bloodline, his past mistakes, but Hermione saw past all of that. She saw him, the person he was trying to be. Why do you believe in me so much? He asked before he could stop himself. Hermione studied him for a long moment. Because I know what it's like to be judged for things you can't change. She shifted slightly, her voice softer. And because you've proven yourself, over and over again. Draco swallowed. He wasn't used to this. Someone seeing the good in him, believing in him even when he struggled to believe in himself. Before he could respond, the back door creaked open. Ginny stood in the doorway, her expression unreadable. Hermione, she said, her voice carefully neutral. "Can I talk to you?" Draco tensed, but Hermione only nodded. "Of course." Ginny hesitated, glancing at Draco before adding, "Alone." Hermione glanced at him briefly before turning back to Ginny. "All right." Draco clenched his jaw but stepped back, watching as Hermione followed Ginny inside. Something told him this wasn't just about him, and he wasn't sure he liked what that meant. Draco lingered outside, leaning against the wooden railing as the cool breeze swept through the Burrow's backyard. His fingers drummed against the wood, his mind racing. Ginny's request to speak to Hermione alone had unsettled him more than he cared to admit. He knew that whatever conversation was happening inside, it wasn't just about strategy or war. It was personal, and he hated not knowing what was being said. Inside the Burrow, Hermione followed Ginny to a quiet corner of the sitting room. The tension between them was palpable. Ginny stood with her arms crossed, her expression guarded. "All right," Hermione said, her voice even. "What is this about?" Ginny hesitated, as if weighing her words. Then she exhaled sharply. "I just don't understand, Hermione. How did this happen?" Hermione frowned. "What do you mean?" "I mean him," Ginny said, her voice edged with frustration. "Draco Malfoy, the same Malfoy who spent years making our lives miserable. The same Malfoy who—" She stopped herself, shaking her head. "How did you go from hating him to whatever this is?" Hermione's expression softened slightly. "People change, Ginny." Ginny scoffed. "Not Malfoy," Hermione sighed. "I used to think that too. But I've seen it happen. I watched it happen." She took a step forward. "He made mistakes, but he's not the same person he was at Hogwarts. He turned his back on everything he was raised to believe in. That wasn't easy for him." Ginny shook her head. "And you trust that?" "Yes," Hermione said firmly. Ginny let out a bitter laugh. "Of course you do." Hermione's brows furrowed. "What's that supposed to mean?" Ginny hesitated again, but then she lifted her chin. "You always try to see the best in people, Hermione. It's who you are. But this is different." She swallowed. "Do you love him?" Hermione's breath caught. The question hit her harder than she expected. Love. The word lingered in her mind, unsettling and undeniable at the same time. She hadn't allowed herself to name it, not yet. But the idea of losing Draco, of him walking away or being taken from her, made her chest tighten in a way she couldn't ignore. Her silence was all the answer Ginny needed. Ginny exhaled, stepping back. I don't get it. But if you're sure about this, then—" She shook her head again. "Just be careful, Hermione. Malfoy might have changed, but that doesn't mean this war won't break him, or you." Hermione met her gaze, determination in her eyes. "I know what I'm doing, Ginny." Ginny studied her for another moment, then nodded stiffly. "I hope so." With that, she turned and walked away, leaving Hermione alone with the weight of her own realization. She didn't just care for Draco, she loved him, and there was no turning back now. Hermione remained in the quiet sitting room long after Ginny had left, her thoughts tangled in the realization that had just struck her. She loved Draco Malfoy. The weight of it settled deep in her chest, both terrifying and exhilarating. It wasn't something she had planned. It wasn't something she had ever imagined. And yet, here she was, choosing him, standing by him, believing in him when no one else would. And she knew, without a doubt, that she wouldn't take it back. Taking a steadying breath, she turned and walked back outside. The cool air brushed against her skin as she spotted Draco still leaning against the railing, staring up at the stars. He turned at the sound of her footsteps. "Took you long enough," he muttered. Hermione smiled faintly. "Were you waiting for me?" Draco scoffed, but there was no real bite to it. "Don't flatter yourself, Granger." She stepped closer until she was right beside him. "Ginny was worried about me." Draco glanced at her. "Worried? About you?" "She doesn't trust you," Hermione admitted. "She thinks I'm making a mistake." Draco let out a dry laugh. "Well, she's not the first." Hermione studied his profile in the moonlight. There was something vulnerable in the way he looked away, as if bracing himself for rejection, for the inevitable moment she would decide he wasn't worth the trouble. She reached for his hand, intertwining her fingers with his. Draco stiffened, his gray eyes snapping to hers in shock. I don't think I'm making a mistake, she said softly. For a moment, he just stared at her, his usual sharp wit failing him. Then slowly his fingers tightened around hers. Hermione smiled. Draco exhaled, shaking his head. You really are ridiculous, Granger. Maybe, she murmured, but you're still here. Before he could respond, the door to the burrow slammed open. Both of them turned as Ron rushed outside, his face pale with urgency. We've got a problem. Draco immediately let go of Hermione's hand, his usual mask of indifference snapping back into place. What happened? Hermione asked, her heart pounding. Ron's expression was grim. The Death Eaters, they're moving. Now. Hermione's blood ran cold. The war wasn't waiting. The final battle was coming, and everything was about to change. The urgency in Ron's voice sent a chill down Hermione's spine. She exchanged a quick glance with Draco before stepping forward. What do you mean they're moving now? She asked, her voice tight. Ron exhaled sharply. We just got word from the Order. The Death Eaters are mobilizing. They're gathering near Hogsmeade. It's happening, Hermione. This is it. Hermione's stomach twisted. They had all known this moment was coming, but hearing it aloud made it real in a way that left her breathless. Draco's expression darkened. How many? Ron shot him a look, clearly still uncomfortable with his presence. A lot, and we're still outnumbered. Draco's jaw clenched. Then we need to be smarter, Ron scoffed. You think? Ron, Hermione warned. This isn't the time. Ron exhaled through his nose, clearly frustrated but nodding. We need to get back inside. McGonagall and the others are planning our next move. Hermione nodded, already shifting into strategy mode. But as she turned to follow Ron back inside, she felt Draco's hand graze her wrist, just for a second, just long enough to make her pause. When she turned back to him, his gray eyes were unreadable. Are you sure about this? He asked quietly. Hermione frowned. Draco, we don't have a choice. I don't mean the war. He hesitated. I mean me. Something in his voice made her chest tighten. He wasn't just asking for reassurance. He was asking if she regretted standing beside him. If, now that the world was about to collapse around them, she would change her mind. She reached up, fingers brushing against his cheek for the briefest moment. I'm sure, she whispered. Draco didn't move. He just stared at her, as if memorizing the way she looked in that moment. Then he let out a slow breath, nodding once. Ron cleared his throat loudly. Can we please go inside before Voldemort kills us all? Hermione sighed, but didn't argue. As they stepped back into the burrow, the atmosphere inside was electric with tension. The members of the Order were gathered around the table, discussing battle plans in hurried voices. Harry stood near the fireplace, his expression grim as he listened to McGonagall. The moment they entered, all eyes turned toward Draco. McGonagall's sharp gaze landed on him. Mr. Malfoy, I hope you understand that this battle will not be merciful. If you are truly on our side, then you will have to prove it. Draco lifted his chin. I wouldn't be here if I wasn't ready. McGonagall studied him for a moment longer before nodding. Then let's prepare. The war had begun, and none of them would ever be the same. The burrow was buzzing with urgency. Spells were being tested, strategies laid out, and last-minute reinforcements called in. Every person in the room understood what was at stake. Hermione stood next to Harry, scanning the large, hand-drawn map of Hogwarts and its surrounding areas. The Death Eaters were gathering near Hogsmeade, and it was only a matter of time before they made their move. We need to get there first, Harry said, his jaw tight. We can't let them take control of the battlefield. Ron nodded. The castle's defenses will help us, but we have to hold the grounds. Draco, standing slightly apart from the others, studied the map with a calculating gaze. The Forbidden Forest, he muttered. Everyone turned toward him. What about it? Hermione asked. Draco tapped a section on the map. The Death Eaters won't attack head-on if they can avoid it. It's too risky, especially with the castle's protections. They'll try to outmaneuver us, use the forest, the secret passageways. He glanced at the group. That's what I'd do. A heavy silence fell over the room. McGonagall narrowed her eyes. Are you suggesting we set an ambush? Draco met her gaze evenly. I'm saying if we ignore the possibility, we'll be slaughtered. Harry exhaled sharply, rubbing his forehead. He's not wrong. Tonks, who had been listening quietly, spoke up. We can set up defensive wards around the forest, to force them into a bottleneck if they try to go around. Kingsley nodded, and we station people at the secret passages. McGonagall straightened. Then it's decided. We move now. The next few moments were chaos. People rushed to grab their wands, whisper last-minute spells, and prepare for battle. Hermione turned to Draco, who was tightening the straps on his wand holster. You didn't have to do that, she said quietly. Draco arched a brow. Do what? Step up like that. He smirked. What? And let you lot walk into a trap? Give me some credit, Granger. She rolled her eyes but couldn't hide the small smile tugging at her lips. Then, before she could second-guess herself, she reached forward, grabbing his hand and squeezing it. Be careful. Draco's expression shifted slightly. He squeezed her hand in return. You too. A sharp whistle rang out, McGonagall's signal. It was time. As they disapparated toward Hogwarts, Hermione's heart pounded in her chest. This was it. The final battle had begun.